Well, I was happy to bring cupcakes, and so, like, if you don't like the book, maybe you'll like the cupcakes. There's something for everybody here. Okay. So, in my discussion today, really, I read the book, and I did some research, especially watching videos of the author, which I always love to do. But I decided not to do additional research on Agatha Christie, who I don't have a depth of knowledge about. So I bet a lot of you know a lot more about Agatha Christie than I do. And I hope you will share that insight or, lead the discussion in that way, so we can all benefit from your knowledge of Agatha Christie herself. I know what I read in this book, and over the years I've read some Agatha Christie, but Shelley texted me last week to say there was a special on PBS on Agatha Christie. I wasn't home at the time. I wish I would have seen that, but
you could probably Google it.
Yes, we could Google it and find it on PBS. So if this makes you interested in learning more about Agatha Christie, there are so many resources out there for that. I'm always interested in the author, so the author's name is Marie Benedict. I'd never read anything by her before. She is a lawyer by trade, and she has at least 10 years experience as a litigator. I think that probably research ability comes in handy with her writing. She's written books about women before, and I would also be interested to hear if y'all have read any of those. One was on Clementine Churchill, Hedy Lamarr, which I heard bits and pieces that Hedy Lamarr is so much more than we maybe know about, that I think that she really was invented Wi-Fi or something like that. So anyway, read the book if you're interested there. And Einstein's First Wife and Carnegie's Maid, those were all topics of hers. Generally, she says when she's picking who to write about, she looks for historical women who have left behind a legacy that we continue to benefit from every day. And in those instances that I just read, I don't really know who Carnegie's Maid is or Einstein's First Wife, and so she wants to write about those to bring their stories to life. She writes about women who are unknown and unappreciated. But in writing about Agatha Christie, she went against her normal way of operating, because Agatha Christie is so well known today, unlike the others that I just mentioned. She says she likes to write about women's struggles and issues that still resound today, and so that we can learn from these women in the past and be grateful for the lessons they teach us. And she says she's always interested in the women's origin stories about, what made them who they became. And she believes, Marie Benedict believes, that Agatha Christie's struggles are still real today. And how she viewed her struggles, she looked at the struggle with family and work, which of course we can talk about, that her mother told her her first responsibility was to her husband, even more so than her daughter. And, writing, she could write, but it would need to be in the background. So that was a struggle. And ambition, a woman being ambitious, that was a struggle at that time. And then feeling guilty about the ambition, that was an issue. And I think that is so true, that these struggles are still with us today. And here's a quick side story. I also work at the Writing Center at UTSA, and students come and ask for help on papers. And this was maybe like 8 years ago. And a student came and sat at my table, and I said, okay, well, what's your assignment? And she said, well, it's really open-ended. The teacher, we could write about anything that has to do with women in the workplace. And I'm like, all right, you're gonna write about guilt, and here's what you're gonna say. If you work, you feel guilty. If you don't work, you feel guilty, and here's what you're gonna do. And this girl, she must have been 18, she was looking at me like, oh my gosh. And then she was like, well, I don't really want to write about that. And I'm like, your teacher would love it. She would love it. But anyway, and so she ended up not writing about it, and I'm sure what she ended up with was not as good as my ideas of women and guilt. And so that's exactly what Marie Benedict was talking about, and you can just see it, in Agatha Christie and moving forward. So she said this book looks at how Agatha Christie rose up to claim her legacy and to start writing her own narrative. And I was looking back at the book just even a little while ago, and you see passages like that in the book where Agatha, according to Marie Benedict, and of course this is historical fiction, is like all about like, no, I'm going to write my story now, and that's what this book is about. And by the way, I can give spoilers or not give spoilers, or we could all give spoilers or not give spoilers, because I know not everyone has read it, and so we'll cross that bridge when we get there, but whatever y'all want, we can do. Okay, and then just so you know what Marie Benedict, her next two books are about, and this one might have either just come out or it's coming out in June. It's called The Personal Librarian, and she wrote it with a co-writer for the first time ever, an African-American writer, and it's this, who was her co-writer. And it's a story about J.P. Morgan's library that maybe some of you all have visited in New York City. And this woman was Rosalind, no, I can't remember the woman's name. She was in charge of his rare manuscript collection. So she had a lot of power in how she shaped the taste of all of New York and beyond. But interestingly, she passed as white. She was actually black, and but in this role, she passed as white, which Marie Benedict was saying she would not have been allowed in the library that she was the manager of. And her father had this powerful legacy of, I guess in the reign of like the lines of Booker T. Washington, but she had to suppress his legacy because she could not reveal that part of her life. And then the next book after that is about Rosalind Franklin, a British scientist in the 40s and 50s who discovered the double helix structure, but whose work was sort of taken by some of her colleagues who wrote the paper, and I guess they got the, was it the Nobel Prize or whatever, that she didn't get, but it was her discovery. So if you're interested in those stories, that's what Marie has been up to lately. Okay, now, do y'all remember last year I spoke to you about Becoming Mrs. Lewis, and Patty Callahan, the author, talked about with historical fiction, and I brought this up last time too when I talked about Hamnet, talked about how she looks at the story as bones, skin, and clothes, where the bones are the historical fact. The skin is things that happen, but you're not exactly sure how, and then the clothes are just the extra things she came up with. But I was interested because Marie Benedict says she looks at it like architecture, with the foundation, the pillars, and the roof. So I guess the foundation is what is historically accurate. You know, the foundation are things that happen, but she's not sure how, and the roof might be things, you know, the dialogue that she invented. Okay, so what do we know? What is for sure? What is the foundation, I guess she would say? We know the date and the place that Agatha met Archibald, and we know he swept her off her feet. We don't know what he said. I don't think we know that he really took her dance card. But, you know, so we know that is true, that they met at the dance. We know that when Agatha escaped or left or whatever, there were 2 letters, and we know the contents of one of them. We know about the letter that she wrote Charlotte, and it was just details about, oh, cancel this, and we need to do this. So it was more like housekeeping things. And Archibald did burn his letter, so we don't know what was in that letter. Now, we know the letter existed because Charlotte said that that letter existed. And Archibald, I guess, over time gave several stories about what was in it or what wasn't in it, but we just don't know. We know the date she went missing, of course. We know when she reappeared. We know, Marie Benedict says she knows what the police were doing every single day of that time period where she was missing. You know, there are newspaper accounts of how people got involved, and we can talk about that. We know, like, her car was found running. The fur coat was not far away from there. Her bag that for their weekend trip that, of course, never happened, was in her car. So we know all of that. And then I don't know if there are other factual things that we know about, but we can talk about that later too. She felt that during the disappearance, Archibald was his own worst enemy. She said research shows that, like doing and saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so, given all of what we know for sure, Marie Benedict said she made logical extrapolation from her research using her experience as a lawyer. So she took what we know and she researched and put it together. So how she prepared for writing this book, she said she did micro and macro research. And what she said, she reread the books that were written during that time by Agatha Christie, especially the book The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which in 2013 was called the best murder mystery ever written by someone, But anyway, it has obviously stood the test of time, that book. And so in that book, it was significant because there was an unreliable narrator, and we're going to talk more about that. And her books, and Marie Benedict thinks that Agatha Christie's books align with her life story. You can read what an author is writing at the time and find pieces of themselves in the book. I think that is fair. She said writers include little bits of themselves in the writing. She also read Agatha Christie's autobiography. Has anyone in here read that? And she said it's not a great research tool because, I guess it's sort of stream of consciousness, like it isn't super organized chronologically. And Agatha Christie did not mention her disappearance in her autobiography. And so the author said it is not research gold, but it did go into her emotions, and maybe she didn't reveal more so she could protect her daughter and regain control of her story, I guess, like that. But anyway, so the author read her autobiography over and over again. She read any biographical information she could find. She traveled to England to get a sense of place, especially she thinks it's significant that Agatha Christie was born and raised in a seaside town, I don't know what you would call it. So she visited the seaside town to get a feel for her upbringing. And the author researched the time period with what was going on politically, what a woman's situation was like at that time, societal changes. So that's how she came. I'm always interested in the kind of research that people do for historical fiction. And so it sounds like she sort of immersed herself in Agatha Christie. In writing this book, she wanted to write a book that was a fast-moving mystery that would be Christie-esque. She wanted to do Agatha Christie justice by trying to write this mystery. And I'll be interested, those of you who have read it, if you thought it was a good fast-paced mystery. I know we were talking last night that it took me a couple times when I first picked it up and I read the first couple chapters. I'm like, okay, I'm not sure, what is going on here? I wasn't sure. I put it aside. And then I picked it back up because, I had to read it. And but I will say, once I got back into it, it was a page turner for me. And I think that structure of having the two side-by-side stories, I wanted to get through the Agatha's view so I could get to the disappearance. It really moved the story along. And also, didn't you like that her sister, with whom she was competitive, really challenged Agatha to write a mystery that was unsolvable? And Agatha took her up on that challenge, and that, I think, started her serious mystery writing. Okay, so Marie Benedict says she looks at Agatha Christie's life as a before the disappearance and after. And that's what I would be interested in, those of you who know more about Agatha Christie after, if you could shed any light on that. But let's talk about before, what she was like before the disappearance. She grew up in a moneyed and a connected upper-class family. Girls in her class did not want to be a nurse. They, were not into bloody scenes or, things like that. But that, in World War I, Agatha Christie did that, and that didn't bother her at all. They said that she, observed amputations, and like, so that part did not scare her off. She did not have any problems with that. And she also became a pharmacist assistant, which we all know that kind of expertise did come in handy for her later writing. And then she was married, and she wanted to write books, but in that time it was hard for women to overtly be writers or authors because family and marital obligations always came before ambition. And so, like, at that time, of course, there were women authors, but in her class, it was people who would do it as a hobby, or like just a little bit at night maybe, but it was never, well, I won't say never, but it was rare to have a woman at that time who was married with children really focused on her writing. And you remember, the mother was a very strong influence for Agatha Christie, and her mother like made clear, you know, your husband is first, even over your daughter. And her personality was gregarious. Y'all saw the detail in the book about how Agatha Christie surfed, and she was really like one of the first European women to ever surf, and evidently she was better at it than Archibald, and who we don't like. No, I'm kidding. And once Marie Benedict read that, and I think she might have even seen a picture of her, she said she had to find a place to put that in the book. That here Agatha Christie is surfing in South Africa. She had a big personality. She did that year-long South African tour where she left her daughter at home and she was, you know, ready to explore. But societal forces, Marie Benedict feels, were building up and weighing her down. And the message she received from society, from her mother, secure a husband, have children, write books as a hobby. And so Agatha, Marie Benedict feels, was placed in that box. The sister married very well, had full staff, which Agatha did not have, and dabbled in writing, and which is probably, that was what was acceptable at that time. Marie Benedict feels that after the disappearance, that was like a rebirth for Agatha Christie. And it was her way of breaking free, and she believes she became a different person after that, or maybe a more authentic self after that. And Marie Benedict says that she feels Agatha Christie got a little more reclusive after that. And I don't know if reclusive is the right word, and I don't know that much about Agatha Christie, but I could see where maybe she became protective of her story and her life maybe, and not as gregarious and out there, but maybe more focused. So I'm not sure about that word reclusive. I don't know enough about Agatha Christie, but I think maybe protective might be a pretty good description, possibly. Okay. So the author thought a very natural structure was having these two sections, with Agatha giving the first person account, the manuscript, which was sort of neat to see the manuscript progress, I thought. And then the husband, his was just what was happening during those 11 days. And she believes, the author says, and I agree, once you think about the book, like, go back and reread it, especially when it comes to the narrator, who, can you really believe what the narrator is saying? And we'll talk about that in a minute. So she thinks, like, go back and reread it, and like, what is there anything now that you know how it ends, like you would go back and question when you're reading about Agatha's view and Archibald's? Who's telling the story? Why? What is the purpose of each story? Okay. All right. Now, there were theories of what really happened during those 11 days. And after having read the book, it's harder for me to believe in these theories. So one, of course, oh, and by the way, once she resurfaced, there were no answers to that question. Really, people did not speak of it. Her daughter never spoke of it. She didn't speak of it. her husband, really didn't speak of it, and her former husband at that point. And so it just was never brought up again, which is so interesting because it was such a huge, it turned into such a huge story, which we'll talk about. So was it a fugue state where a person is disassociated from who they are? And I mean, I don't know enough about that, but the author says, yes, she was in a state of great stress and trauma, as you can imagine, with her husband, presenting her with the information that he was going to go off and marry someone else, and disparaging her and having this new contract with the publisher. So she was under great stress and trauma. And the author said, when I look at her, I see a woman who is really struggling. So, so that could say, well, maybe there was some kind of mental issue. Some say, was it a publicity stunt? And it did not hurt her sales after that. True. However, the author felt this is not the kind of notoriety that Agatha Christie would have wanted for herself. And really, no one could have predicted the attention that this event caused. She had written before, she had written some of her mysteries, but she wasn't like super famous when this happened. She was not at all at the peak of her popularity. So no one, I think, really could have predicted what happened. But what happened, the press took hold of the story, maybe because the car was running and the fur coat was not far behind and the suitcase was in the trunk, and you have Archibald, who is not making any situation better. And so the press got interested, which got local attention, and then national attention, and then international attention. And weren't you interested in those stories of the hordes of people who would show up they drained the pond or whatever. I don't know if they drained the pond, but they dredged, thank you. They dredged the pond. They took off and covered so much grounds looking for her, and just all of these people would show up. So did she do it for publicity? Well, I mean, it did turn into this huge thing, but no one could have anticipated that. She wasn't really famous at that time, and so the author doesn't believe that she did that for publicity. The author says it was a private matter that became public, and how much of that was her intention. And after that, Agatha Christie became skittish about the publicity, which I think is understandable. But here's what I loved. I saw an interview with the author, and the interviewer was a young, almost a college student. So I really enjoyed the interview. And so the young interviewer said, "So do you really think your fictional account is the answer?" And she was like, yes, I do. She said, the book showed what really happened. Yes, it's fiction, but I believe and I hope it's true. And that's exactly the way I felt about it when I read it. Now I think going forward, when I think about Agatha Christie, I'm going to be like, yeah, right on, Agatha Christie. And I believe it because, I don't think it was a fugue state, because I don't even really know what that is. And I don't think it was, just publicity. I just think maybe it was her taking control of the situation in such a clever way that fits in with who she is or who she was and became. So I love that the author is like, yeah, I totally think that's what happened. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about unreliable narrators in a minute, but before I do y'all have any favorite parts of the book or any insight into who Agatha became or anything that you want to add to that? What part, did any of that make you cringe? Or did any of you feel for Archibald at all? No.
The relationship that Agatha had with her mother was a fascinating one for me. And I related so to the author's description of Agatha as she went through that house and she, even though she was one of two daughters, it was basically her responsibility to go through her mother's large home and go through all those boxes. And she talks about having to go through every book because there might be a letter or a poem. And I just felt the advice her mother kept giving her about putting your husband first just didn't seem appropriate to me. But I could only justify it with her mother did not want her to marry Archie to begin with.
Right.
She met him and didn't like him to begin with. She knew this is not the person that's good for my daughter. And I think that divorce would have been something that was not socially acceptable of that class at that time. And I think maybe she gave Agatha that advice, the advice that she did not give her other daughter. But she gave that advice to her because she said, the only way this marriage is ever going to work is you have to stroke that ego that he has. And
that's the only way this is going to work. Yeah.
So that's the only way so I found that relationship so interesting.
That was, and I was rereading some of the book today, and I had forgotten this, that was really wounding to Agatha, that when her mother died, the husband was not supportive in any way. Like, that was sort of the last straw. At this very difficult part of my life, you are not helping at all. Now, as a mother, we don't know if it's true that he said, like, hey, burn your dance card or get rid of your dance card. But, like, as a mother, I'm like, that's trouble, If someone wants to go against the accepted norm and tells you to, like, get rid of your dance card, like, that is a red flag, right? I think that is really interesting. And that's when the author said she was in a place of great stress and trauma and pressure, and it's like,
and then her mother just died.
Yes. And can't you see her mind working?
Yeah.
Yeah. First
Oh,
you and then.
well, I'm just going to go back to Mary Leslie too, and I really didn't like that her mother kept telling her to put him first, ignore the daughter, and then when I realized she didn't give the same advice to the sister, like Mary Leslie said, I realized this isn't her blanket advice. She realizes something's up here.
Yeah.
And she's doing the best she can to save
make
the
it
family.
work.
Yeah, to make it work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She seemed like such a strong woman to be so almost subservient to Archibald, who is just a horrible person. And I was confused about the relationship between her and her child and Archibald, and this child that he didn't even want in the first place. But he seemed to grow to be more in tune with the daughter, and the daughter cared for him more than she did her mother. And from what I gather, Agatha Christie left to somehow or other let her daughter know as she grew older that she was not to blame for what happened between her and Archibald, that it was the father's the father's doing.
Yes.
Whereas if she didn't do something to let her daughter know that, then the daughter would always think that she was to blame.
Exactly, and that's the part I reread just an hour ago, where Archibald was like, well, what do you mean? You would get custody, and I never said I was going to take the daughter. And she said no, but growing up, she would never know that, you would look blameless in all of this, and I wouldn't. And I thought that was really interesting, how she was doing it so that her daughter would see the picture. And the description of the daughter and having this nice relationship with the dad, you know, I've had friends who are divorced and they're like, oh yeah, my ex-husband is like the fun one, you know? And I think that's a theme that continues. Like, so this, you're watching your daughter have this really good relationship with her father, which you're happy that she has a good relationship, but it seems a little unfair, you know, like he can swoop in and be sort of the fun one or the nice one. But I think that was convincing to me. Like, why would she do this? Well, she said in the book that she wanted her daughter to know that what was happening at that time, and that she did it for her daughter. And I might get to that in my notes, or I might have skipped it, but one thought is that Marie Benedict put that in the book, the good relationship between Archibald and the daughter, to humanize Archibald, so we can see, you know, some good points about him. That, you know, he had this nice relationship with the daughter.
Didn't work for me.
It didn't work? I know, exactly. Which leads me to this topic of the unreliable narrator, because when I was researching a little bit, this term kept coming up. And I had to like harken back to my old English classes, like, what is the unreliable narrator? So I looked it up, and well, here we go. Let me tell you what an unreliable narrator is. This is just straight from the internet. An unreliable narrator is a storyteller whose perspective isn't totally reliable if we want to get the full picture or the whole truth. A narrator might be unreliable because they're deliberately deceptive or because they're innocently misguided. When it comes to first-person narratives, one might say that they are all unreliable to some degree, because each of us can perceive the same event in different ways and remember things subjectively. It might also just be the narrator is naive and doesn't have the knowledge or information to present the full picture. This can also be a useful method for character development. To identify a narrator as unreliable is not to say they're bad or somehow cheating or lying to the readers. However, it's important to consider how the narrator's perspective and biases might influence the way the story is told. This can also help us better understand their motivations. So I think if you were to go back and read it and try to look at Archibald and see, like, okay, who's telling his story, and is it, you know, why was this story told? And I don't know, maybe we would have a different view of Archibald. I don't know. I mean, maybe not. And what was going on at the time, that book that Agatha Christie had just written used an unreliable narrator. And so that's what made Marie Benedict start thinking about this. And then from the internet, while it might sound like a bad thing, the unreliable narrator is sometimes used as a literary device by authors to enhance the reading experience and make us think about our own perspectives. As I was reading it, I don't know if y'all felt the same way, but I was like, wait, you know, what's going on? And near the end, you know, it's like, whoa, what just happened there? So it does make you stop and think about who's telling the story, what's the purpose, and things like that. And the author said, you know, think of social media. Are any of us, are we unreliable narrating our lives? Because with social media, Facebook or Instagram, authenticity is usually not our goal.
Right.
There's always that suspension of disbelief.
Yes, willing suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
Exactly. I love that. So, you know, the husband had to perform the role. Christie was careful about what she said. In writing this book, she said when she was writing Agatha Christie's story, she had to be careful about what she revealed. The author felt she probably needed to withhold things until it was the right time to talk about. And you know, so the author, what else? Not add too much illuminating detail as she wrote the book. Nothing on the surface seems wrong at certain points. So but you have to have a sense that something's missing. The author, Marie Benedict, doles out bits and pieces of information to keep that air of mystery. You know, I watch Dateline NBC a lot, and like, you know, I'm like, who did it? I don't understand that. And then the last 10 minutes are like, and we didn't mention that the neighbor a week before had knocked the tent. And I'm like, well, had I known that at 9 o'clock, I wouldn't be, you know, like, duh, that explains everything. So anyway, so Marie Benedict probably had to hold some of that back and decide when she was going to reveal some of those things. But Archibald could not be totally loathsome, although it sounds like he was to us. So Marie Benedict had to make him more human, showing his relationship with his daughter, show him before the war and after the war, his transformation. And Marie Benedict says, I mean, did he have PTSD, coming back from the war and just being thrust into the situation? We have to be able to see why she was attracted to him at the beginning. And she said, a World War I pilot, flying was relatively new. Like, that was very brave and exciting. And, that was a big deal to be a pilot. I mean, still, but a World War I pilot, there's something there. And so, like, that had to make him more appealing to her. And he did seem to change after the war, or maybe she withheld details and we didn't see what he was like before the war, although he did tell her to get rid of the dance card, which I cannot condone. I don't know. So anyway, so there is that. Now, I read this book on Kindle, and so once I started learning about the Unreliable Narrator, I searched narrator in the book, and it came out that it was used 6 times, and I have just a few of these instances that talk about that. So the first one, these are the words of Agatha Christie's in her section, her character. It was the first book under my new Collins contract, and I wanted it to dazzle. As I reread it for a final time, it occurred to me that we are all unreliable narrators of our own lives, crafting stories about ourselves that omit unsavory truths and highlight our invented identities. And that's what we were talking about, that we all do that to a certain extent. And then, let me read this passage. It fits right into what the author was talking about here. I could never have become that person as Archie's wife, the man I believed him to be, the man who could have fostered my strengths and talent into being, never existed. I wrote him into being on the first night we met on the dance floor at Chudley Hall, just as I had the characters in my detective novels. But I could never get him quite right because I was an unreliable narrator of my own life with only the vaguest sense of myself. In any event, even if he had been the man I'd hoped for, he could never have been my fate, as I understand that notion while still a girl, because each of us, man or woman, has our own fate, less fate than hard work and circumstance, I've come to believe. So that is interesting, okay? And then she says this to Archibald later. As you changed, you wanted someone who suited the newly confident and successful you. When it became clear that I couldn't be that person, I was too familiar with your failings, your dark disappointments, and your history, you were drawn to Nancy. You wanted to become your own reliable narrator, rewriting your past and your present history to suit the story you told yourself and Nancy, but I couldn't let you do that. That's so good. That's so good. And let's see, what is this? Surely a writer, so this is what the author said later, Marie Benedict, in the end of the book, maybe y'all read it. Surely a writer this talented in the art of plotting could not have been a victim in her own vanishing. How could she have suffered from amnesia or gotten herself into some sort of fugue state? She had to have crafted her disappearance as skillfully as she crafted her mysteries as a vehicle to serve her own ends. And again, Marie Benedict said she really wanted to look at before the disappearance and after, and how she felt that it was after the disappearance is when Agatha Christie sort of came into her own. And so she said she used her skill and talent to moxie to escape from the confines of her era and wrest control of her life. Yay, Agatha, right? Yeah.
Were you surprised that Nancy Neely or Neil wasn't disgraced? I was surprised that he could go on and marry her.
Yes, okay, and didn't you love that, like, when he shows up at the end to find her, and they're like, hello, and they call her, the last name, is it Neil or whatever, and he's like, what? And that she took, and that is real. I think she took on that name during her disappearance. And awesome, don't you love that? Exactly. And that she wasn't disgraced. That is interesting, yeah. And that so I did look a little bit at Wikipedia. He did marry her later, and then she married someone else later, and whatever. But and also the other thing I liked about the book is this letter that we don't know what it says, but he kept being like, and I've got to do this because of that letter. It tells me that if I don't do this, it's going to be, worse. And so it really, she had a way of keeping him in line or doing what she wanted him to do. She had that control over the situation.
And he believed it.
And he believed it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That says something about how he really viewed her like, oh man, I think she's. It's gonna happen.
And her appearance had changed.
Her appearance had changed after, or during the marriage.
No,
Yeah.
during her estate.
Yes.
She came out in a beautiful gown, and
Yes.
she had lost weight, and she looked
Yes.
so much better than, as I remember, he had complained about
He had complained.
her appearance
Yes.
as into their marriage. And
Yes.
from what I gather, he must have been a very, very handsome
Mm-hmm.
man.
Yes. He did
Are there
complain.
any images of them that you saw?
Well, no, but I didn't see any. But what I did hear was at the time she went missing, the police or the media published these pictures of here's what she might look like here, and it had pages of her in disguises, maybe she looks like this, so be on the lookout, and it had and I didn't see those pictures. However, I read this on Kindle, and I think in the hardback book, at the beginning or end, the author included some of those pictures that were put out by the media. This is what she might look like if you're trying to find her. She might have these disguises. But isn't that funny? And then in the book, she had to then finally just walk around with the newspaper that had her picture so that someone would get wise to the fact that she was there.
So different from today, right? The all
Right.
over social media.
So different from today, exactly. That would be very hard to do. But having read this, I think it's plausible what the author came up with, what Marie Benedict came up with. I think it's more plausible than some of the other theories, personally. But
Did she have any grandchildren with the
I
daughter?
don't know.
She does.
Oh, yeah.
She does. Yeah.
Grandson.
She has a grandson.
That inherited all her fortune.
Well,
Wow.
the second husband and the daughter, yeah. got
Yeah.
involved.
Oh, she had other children too?
But she had another husband.
Yeah, I think she had another.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I really enjoyed it, once I got back in it, and then it really was a page turner for me because of the way it was what he's going through. And the more you know about him, you're like, oh, it just seems so rich that he is struggling through those 11 days. And they're like, well, we're sure you'd like to join us for the search, for your wife. And he was like, oh yeah, I'll be right there. So
I just love it. It's still a secret.
it's still, and again, and
Yeah.
there are few things that are still secrets.
Yeah.
There are few things in this world that are still secrets. And I don't think that there's a letter somewhere where she explains it that 100 years after her death we'll find it. No, it is a secret, and people just didn't talk about it.
And she never said anything other than amnesia. I don't know.
Yeah, and she was like, well, that's enough talk about that. Let's talk about something else. Yeah, she didn't want to talk
She
about
didn't
it.
have to speculate. She didn't have to feed the frenzy.
Yeah,
So she's written the best mystery of
Yes,
all.
she did. She plotted the best mystery.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. Any other comments or anything you want to explore?
And there are probably more references to her style of writing and as anyone.
Yes.
We're real mystery buffs, and there are all sorts of references to her.
And I forgot to mention, which you all probably know, she is the best-selling novelist. So, and as far as sales go, the Bible is first, Shakespeare is second, and Agatha Christie is third.
Wow.
And one of these interviewers was like, well, I lived in Japan with my family for a while in the 70s, and we couldn't find anything in English except we could get any Agatha Christie book. Isn't that interesting?
when she came to the United States, to New York with Archie, they were married at the time, she said the thing that she most looked forward to seeing in New York was she wanted to go to a cafeteria where people ate off of trays. Food on trays.
It's interesting.
And then when she was a girl, growing up, you couldn't have women and men on the beach, on that beach at
In her
house.
seaside town?
And in a bathing costume at the same time. Yeah.
Wow.
And then to think she served and stood up and was
Yes.
forward.
Yes.
I will not do that.
Those were the good old days. No, I'm
Yeah.
kidding. Okay, anything else? Okay, well, if you haven't read it, you know, we didn't give everything away, and I think you would really enjoy it. And if you have read it, you know, the author would love you to go back and reread it now that you're really more aware of how she viewed the role of the narrator, that maybe you can't believe everything that Marie Benedict wrote, or, you know, you could go back and look at that. I did go back and reread a little bit. I started at the beginning. And the first line, I think, was, "I could not have written a more perfect man." Isn't that interesting? And then later, near the end, she said, "I wrote him into being on the first night we met, but I could never get him quite right." So interesting. But anyway, I went back to reread it, and the first chapter is about the letter. And then it goes on, you know, to the dance or whatever. So I do encourage you, once you've read it, to go back and start from the beginning, just to read a few chapters to sort of complete that circle.
Do you know how many books she wrote?
I do not know how many books, but, you know, think about it like the Poirot books. The, how many? 66. I mean,
She
prolific.
wrote under other names.
And she did write under other names.
Did a whole romance.
That's what I read, yeah. So she didn't just do mysteries.
And look how long her play was shown in London.
Yes. You know, so someone that smart, that clever and creative, can't you just see like she's in a terrible position and she's like, light bulb, you know. But now she did say, you know, it took her a while to plan it, and so she didn't hide any of their troubles from certain friends or from the help, so that later when they were interviewed by police, they would be like, oh yeah, they had a bad fight that night. And, you know, so I mean, according to the way Marie Benedict pictures it, this had been in the planning stage for a little bit of time. It had to be with those details.
My idea was maybe Archibald was jealous of her.
Totally, yeah. I think so. And, you know, and when he came back from the war, he had trouble finding a job, and like, it was an uncomfortable situation for her because she was making money that the family needed, but yet, you know, that was, she couldn't make a big deal of it because that was threatening to him. So I think he probably maybe was jealous and threatened, which is probably why he complained a lot about the house, you know.
Well, I feel sorry for Archie.
I know,
I
you
think
do.
we've written too much bad about him.
Well,
You know,
and that is
that's
definitely,
my mother's view.
yeah, that is definitely a possibility because the way Marie Benedict wrote it, you know, what we know about Archie, I now call him Archie, what we know about Archibald is what she decided to create. I mean, we don't know what he said. Yeah, but, okay, I did glance at like a New York Times article about the disappearance, and it said like, when they walked out of the place where they found her, that they described him as being stone-faced. You know, so I mean, he's like, oh, I mean, you know, I mean, he was, which I think is revealing. You know, he didn't have a big smile on his face.
Martha,
Yeah,
sorry.
no.
Did you read anywhere in your research, was he already engaged, like this book, like the book suggested that?
I think he was. I did not see that in my research, but So I don't know if that's what was gonna happen that weekend, although it might have been, like, I think he had one foot out that door.
Yeah, I don't feel sorry for him.
Yeah. But he was a World War I pilot, and, and we don't know what happened to him during the war either.
I read that Nancy's parents sent her on a year-long world tour to avoid the scandal to their family.
Yeah,
Well, that's what I was wondering about,
Yeah.
it just seems like
that was a good plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Can you get engaged to someone before you're divorced? I guess you can, right? Can you?
Well, I suppose you can get
It's not
engaged,
illegal.
but you can't get
You
married.
can't get married,
Yeah.
so that would be.
Because an engagement isn't legal or official, probably. And then that was just one little passage. She's like, what would have happened had I married the guy from my youth that our parents thought we were going to get married,
But she couldn't have rewritten him either.
No.
Archie was who he was.
Yes.
And it just didn't work out to stay the shining image that she was infatuated to begin with.
Exactly.
So you can't resist someone in a uniform. Well, he was a uniform pilot, but she couldn't write him into being something that he wasn't.
Exactly.
And he deserved his happiness.
Yeah.
No.
Yes, he
And we saw he was a good dad. And, and we all know nice people who just aren't made for each other,
Can't rise to what the other person needs.
Exactly. Huh.
People change.
He was dashing in his uniform.
He was dashing and a pilot.
And then he
But,
got chubby.
yeah. But how adventurous she was like, I've always, I would love to fly, even from, I think that was one of their first conversations. So anyway, I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate the opportunity to read it and discuss it. Thank you all.